So, continuing to unpack the problem just a little bit more and staying in the cloud as much as possible as well, I'm going to do a little bit of audience participation here, okay? So I'm going to ask you to raise your hands. So I'm going to ask the question, in hybrid and multi-cloud environments, what tends to fail first, okay? So the options are visibility, identity governance, accountability, or none of the above, okay? All right, what tends to fail first, guys? Okay, who says visibility? No one. Okay, identity governance. Oh, I've got a few. All right. Okay, accountability. Yeah, that's a good one. It's hard to understand what you're even accountable for, right? Okay, so I'm going to turn to the panel and see what you guys think. Thanks for that.
All right. So that was a good question. And, I have two of the folks on my team right here who raised their hands for identity. But on this occasion, I will disagree. I would say that accountability is probably the first thing that fails. And identity and visibility are downstream symptoms, if you will, of that root cause, right? And why do I say that? So when you really look at, in terms of the single ownership problem, hybrid or multi-cloud wasn't really a security strategy. It was mostly because of the outcome of a business decision or a series of business decisions, right? Think about, probably there was a regional team. They wanted to use AWS because speed. Some other team wanted to use Azure because of Microsoft licensing, the most common thing that you'd hear, right? And maybe during a carve-out or a merger or an acquisition, that's how an enterprise with Google Cloud came into your environment. So the point I'm trying to make here is that, those are decisions which are made as business decisions. But in most cases, the security owner or the security architect may not even be in the room for those decisions. So they kind of inherit a lot of the environment after the architecture is already laid out, right? And what that leads to is this, the joint problem statement. Who owns the joint problem statement, right? If it's the cloud team who owns, let's say, the workloads, and the security team owns the policies, and the app team owns the apps, the cloud provider owns uptime, and the vendor owns the tools, right? Now, if something happens, if there's an event, if there's a breach, if there's anything, right? Who's the owner, right? And that's where I feel that accountability starts first, and everything else basically follows, right? And from that downstream, I would say that visibility is, if your accountability is fragmented, your visibility is likely also going to be fragmented in terms of who's really looking at what and bothering about what, right? And identity is probably the most important element, I would say, from a governance perspective to be factored, but it comes downstream, right? And the reason why identity, I would say, is super important right now is that the system's no longer built for humans logging into systems, right? You have workloads, you have microservices, you have APIs, you have automation pipelines, you have all these other things basically in the cloud now, which are all attack surfaces, right? And identity becomes that singular control plane which can dictate who accesses what, to what extent, and in what context. And that's why I think identity governance, right, is really going to be key as that third element over here.
Thanks, Rohan. Anyone have a different perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it, I think it actually creates kind of a false, what do you call it? False dichotomy, but with three. What's it? A false trichotomy, right?
I did say none of the above was fair.
Okay. Then I'm going to go with...
I forgot to ask, though, if anyone had said none of the above, I think. Anyways, go ahead.
Then I'm going to say, actually, the thing that I see fail first, usually AWS East.
AWS East? Does anyone agree with that?
But in all seriousness, I've lived through a lot of cloud failures. Not something I'm proud of, but I've seen a lot of failures, and really most of them, when I think back, fit into none of these categories cleanly. I'd actually kind of flip the question on its head and say that what we need to think about is these are all three ways we can prevent cloud failure, right? Without visibility, when whatever breaks does break, you're not going to see it, right? Without governance, how do you know what you're managing? And I'd actually posit that accountability is a key part of governance and not a separate failure mechanism. So I think they all three go together as part of your solution set rather than key pieces of your failure scenarios.
Thanks, John.
I'll just add two things to that. So US East has more AWS services than any other site location. So if you look at it, when you subscribe to services using US East, it will warn you that oftentimes there is not redundancy in this service and people click through it anyways. And so it's a part of the governance process that when you're deploying something and you're warned, make sure you take that into account as a part of that process as well.
Fair shot.
Can I just respond to that? Yes, and no offense to anybody who works at or may have worked at AWS. And in all reality, I think, and we talked about this before, like we talked about there needs to be a shift in culture and thinking in how you work with cloud. Part of that is planning for failure, right? And if you're not building for failure, you're not leveraging the cloud correctly and you're not building for the cloud correctly. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, to pile on, I think in the event of an incident too, having ephemeral services that you can immediately reconstitute to get back in operation versus leaving them down while you try and do forensic analysis and figure out what happened, right? That's another key piece of how the approach in the cloud is so different from on-prem, right? And it's really key to be able to respond quickly when there's an incident.